Welcome again to History Burst on the Plains Wars. So conflicts across America, building upon previous bursts that have already started to outline sources of potential tension between the white Americans and the native Indians of America. There are various reasons for increasing tensions between the whites and the Indians. Previously spoken about the discovery of gold that led to tensions when an influx of wannabe miners would disturb the natural way of life of the Plains Indians in increasing numbers in 1849 with the 49ers and then 1858 in Colorado. Attitudes to settlers, it's already outlined that they believe that the native way of running their bands and tribes is very different. It's reckless, it doesn't work, that the way they fight their wars is cowardly, and that their religion is just nonsense. They disagree with the nomadic lifestyles, they think they're wasteful of land, and the disputes over buffalo herds and polluted water sources lead to outbreaks of cholera, which again is met with a response from natives with increasing numbers of attacks on the wagon trains of settlers. The railroads, obviously building their tracks through Native American territory despite the permanent Indian frontier, that great American reservation that should protect the Indians' land, actually violates the treaties. The government encourages the railway companies to hunt the buffalo to make money from transporting hunters. But this obviously impacts on the native survival because their reliance upon the buffalo. Some Indians attack the railway tracks, the railway lines, the trains themselves, ambushing the workmen, and so the military have to build forts in order to protect the railroads themselves. Ranching, so cattle farming, so rearing of cattle. Like cows and bulls. Again, the cattle drive through the Indian lands disrupts their way of life, disturbs the buffalo herds, which forces the buffalo to eat grass as the herds eat their grass on their way to market. And again, Indians can attack ranchers in protest. So, you know, the early tension is on the rise and on the rise quite quickly from more than one avenue. Yeah, it's not just one big thing that the two groups are upset over. There are overlapping sources of tension, and you need to be able to track those. Fort Laramie Treaty is one of the first big treaties trying to de-escalate the situation. 1851, the tension between Plains Indians and white settlers had become so real that the government had to step in. The government are keen to expand the settlement of the land further westwards, manifest destiny, but struggling to know how to keep the Plains Indians and the white settlers apart. So they come up with this Fort Laramie Treaty, which, as outlined in the yellow box, each of the Plains Indian tribe are given their own territory. White settlers and travellers and railroad surveyors were allowed to cross the tribal land safely. The American government was allowed to establish forts and roads within Indian territory, and selected chiefs from each tribe would negotiate with the American government. The Plains Indians should pay if their people broke the treaty, and likewise the American government promised to protect the Indians from white settlers. And if the Plains Indians stuck to the treaty, they would be given food and money, $50,000 a year, which is a lot of money. However, the consequences, it's all right on paper, in theory, it kind of ticks a few boxes, but it ends the idea of this one big reservation, great permanent Indian frontier, instead concentrating each tribe within their own land, so lots of different smaller reservations, if you will. Creates this relationship in which the Plains Indians become dependent on the American government for food and money, which is absolutely different to what their culture has kind of evolved into. You know, so they're starting to be expected to behave in a certain way by the American government in exchange for this, if you will, charity. The treaty is written in English, and so without sufficient interpreters, many tribes didn't fully understand what they had agreed to. So again, that is miscommunication in many parts and the cultural differences and misunderstandings. The American government was used to the idea of having these elected representatives, but the Plains Indians had no single leader, so individual bands still kind of just did what they wanted, as they had done for many years. This idea of concentrating, the Fort Laramie Treaty failed, and so this idea of concentrating Indians on certain parts of land and concentrating whites on others, it just didn't work in practical means. And as you've got there, you have a wide variety of ways in which the treaty failed. From top left, a lot of tribes didn't even know the treaty existed, so of course it's going to fail. The promised payments for sticking to the treaty weren't always made by the government to the Indians. The American government didn't protect Plains Indians when the white settlers broke the treaty, travelling through or causing conflict, which again increases resentment. And those migrants who were, supposed to be able to cross the Indian land without fear of attack, didn't stick to the official trails. So, they come off the official trails and, still break the treaty by going onto land that they shouldn't go onto, which again increases that tension. The Indian Wars, you need to know why they occurred, and obviously the resolution of them. So briefly outlined here are some of the reasons for the Indian Wars in the 1860s. We've already mentioned the broken agreements, such as the Fort Laramie Treaty, clash of culture, Manifest Destiny versus Caretaker, poor conditions on the reservations. They're often starving to death because, the land is not for farming. The Indians are not going to be put on reservation lands that is good quality, so they're doomed to fail as a farmer, and the widespread killing of buffalo means what they depend upon is harder and harder to hunt. Manifest Destiny I've mentioned. Homestead Act, obviously we'll come back to that a little later on in a different burst, but it increases the number of settlers who want to actually settle on the plains, on lands perhaps that they shouldn't, and it's government backed. So there's again just no let up on the increasing tension between these two groups. And so you have two pretty significant outbreaks of war. We have Little Crow's War, and then you have there in grey a rundown of Little Crow's War, the Sioux warrior chief who, pushed back against the government, who was failing to make the promised payments, who was failing to give them suitable land for farming on their reservation, refusing to hand over supplies to the tribe, and so as a result, the tribe were starving. And so the hunting party, kills 5 white settlers. Little Crow attacks a town, stealing food, supplies, killing 700 or more white settlers and soldiers. And so the government sends in the army to respond, many of whom surrender, but many then are sentenced to death and eventually hanged as retribution. And then the Cheyenne uprisings. Again, after the Treaty of Fort Laramie, we've got various nations, given vast land, but it's not land that is useful for them. And when gold is discovered, it caused that gold rush in 1858 of huge numbers onto the Indian territory that they shouldn't have done. So again, you've got reducing of lands. We've got poor quality of land for farming, so conditions get very difficult for the Indians. And so again, the Cheyenne Indians are angry about giving up their lands for little in return. And faced with starvation in 1863, they begin attacking wagon trains and stealing food for supplies. And the confrontations just continue to get worse. Sand Creek Massacre should be 1864, not 1964. It's a typo. Vetterman's Trap, 1866. And again, you have painful consequences for these Indians as retribution from the American government and settlers. In more detail, you have a summary of Sand Creek Massacre, Vetterman's Trap, Red Cloud's War. Again, you need to be familiar with some of these case studies, like the settlers such as John Party, so that you can evidence these plains wars as a direct result of that increasing clash of cultures that has been previously discussed in prior bursts. So please take the time, pause the video, have a read of these 3 case studies for your contextual knowledge. All right, so you can pause the video and read it through and then press play again to move on. Consequences of the Indian Wars, again listed quite clearly. You see an increase of the retribution from the white government. You have further treaties that just aren't held to, which again, makes life more difficult, which increases opportunity for conflict. Disease that is brought because of either famine, starvation, or interaction with whites means that Indian numbers fell. The Sand Creek Massacre, the memory of that kind of reinforces to many Indians that you cannot trust what the white government says. So just, no matter what you say, it's not going to be accepted. And we have tribes being increasingly forced onto smaller and smaller areas of poorer and poorer quality land, which, Battle of the Little Bighorn is seen as the last kind of great hurrah. Even despite the Indians winning, it means the backlash of revenge from the white American government that demands retribution sees the end of the Indian resistance, if you will, despite their initial victory at Bighorn. A later burst will cover that. And so we have, in the 1860s, the relationships between the Indians and the whites getting worse and worse and worse until, the relationship deteriorates until it's non-existent almost.